All right, ladies and gentlemen, onward and upward. Let's talk about the last section here, Chapter 5, Section 4. And so it mainly focuses on the changing of ecosystems and communities over time. And so that term is succession. So ecological succession is the change of one species to another, or from one set of species to other sets of species, becoming more and more complicated in a specific area. And that change can happen either as a primary succession or a secondary succession. And so it says right here, gradual establishment of biotic communities in lifeless areas where no soil or sediment starts. So this would be from barren land. So when new barren land is exposed, primary succession is the process of how life first starts to establish itself on that. So a volcanic island that it forms for the first time would be an example of primary succession. Secondary succession is where we already have some soil present, but we've kind of removed all of the ecosystem components, the organisms from it, and we're kind of reestablishing things and redoing it. So a tilled up field or something along those lines could be a secondary succession location. Let's take a closer look at these. So here's primary succession, and this illustration kind of shows us what we're getting at with this. And so we have weathered exposed rock that's doesn't have anything in it, no form of soil or anything like that. It starts here, and in the end we have a well-established mature forest at the far end of it. And it's a simple process of, the rocks start to break down and turn into fine dirts from lichens and stuff attaching themselves to it. So you have lichens and moss in the first layer. That's replaced with very small shrubs and grasses that develop into hardier shrubs and grasses and eventually trees. So you get this movement from a very simple, basic ecosystem in this first stage, once there's a mite bit of soil and other things established, up here to a very complex ecosystem with many different types of old established trees. And this process usually takes a really long time, anywhere from hundreds to thousands of years to create this last step, a good, great old forest, or old growth forest, for instance. So here's just pictures or illustrations of that same idea for you. So here are the bare rocks. First establishment of what we call pioneer species, which is a really important term. These are the very first things to show up. So we see those on lichens on our mountain when we have new rocks exposed, or mosses, things like that. They can actually attach to rocks and then start the process of breaking down the rocks and using that as their established area. Then you see small patches of shrubs and grasses in the next picture before you get into large established trees. And so this would be how primary succession would go, starting with no soil. Okay. So again, early successional plants here are called pioneer. And so you should know that term. You should know some examples. Mosses and lichens are a good example of that. They're usually brought in by wind. Sediment will be trapped by wind. You'll have slight bits of moisture and then the breaking apart of those little rocks. Early successional plants, like the pioneer ones, get replaced by mid-successional plants, and those fit under the categories of grasses and low shrubs, which then go from 1 to 2, and then we end up with 3 being the late successional plants, which is mostly all trees and well-developed organisms. Secondary succession is a similar idea, except it's kind of jump-started because the soil is already present. But nonetheless, we have that basic annual plant that just comes in, grows for 1 year, and then is gone, which gets replaced by perennials that can last for a longer period of time, which then turns into shrubs, which then turns into young, immature trees, and then old growth forests. This process doesn't take quite as long, anywhere from 100 to 200 years to work its way through this process, because the soil is already present here. These are usually caused in nature as a result of fires and floods. But humans can also create or establish a kind of a blank canvas at this end for this process to start. And so a fire is a good example shown right here. This fire right here is showing new growth all the way around it. This would be secondary succession. This one, we can see that we've kind of trimmed away this area Probably human activities kind of remove this, and you're starting to see these trees and these plant species start to sprout for the first time in those locations. And so, important term that you bump into here, that last stage of those big old growth forests are what we call the climax community. That's the end goal. If it can get that far along in the process before the ecosystem is destroyed and reestablished, you get to what we call a climax community, which is kind of the highest end process that's available there. The truth of the matter, though, is you can't really gauge what's going to happen with this successional process because it varies all the time. But typically, the traditional view says it eventually becomes a stable complex community. The current view is this process is ever changing, and you go back and forth and here and there and to and fro, and you get all kinds of vegetation that occurs. And so it's not as clean and simple and neat as the pictures show. It's a state of continual disruption and change. And so it's not always just a straight line effect. It can go back and forth and do all kinds of different things. That's the end of section 5. Tune in for, I believe, section 9.